Good evening, everybody, to the fourth debate of term, and a very busy house it is this evening. I'm very excited to say that we have a very topical debate this evening, given that it's less than a week to the US elections. The motion before us this evening is, this House welcomes the decline of America. Just a few House rules before we begin. There'll be 6 paper speakers this evening, a speech from the proposition, then opposition, followed by a round of floor speeches, in which you guys, the audience, get to take part, then another round of paper speakers, floor speeches, and the final round of paper speakers. You have the opportunity to make a point of information if you disagree with anything that one of our speakers says. Just raise your hand and say, point of information on that point, and you can challenge any of the speakers. They can accept your request or deny it. I'd also encourage that you keep this brief and relevant to the discussion, preferably under 20 seconds, and always do make sure that it is academically relevant. So, I'd like to introduce the first speaker to the House this evening, Professor Mary Kaldor. Professor Mary Kaldor is a Professor Emeritus of Global Governance and Director of the Conflict and Civicness Research Group at the London School of Economics. She's pioneered the concepts of new wars and global civil society. She was a founding member of European Nuclear Disarmament and the Helsinki Citizens Assembly. She's the author of many books and articles, including International Law and New Wars, with Kristin Chink in 2017, and Global Security Cultures in 2018. You have the ears of the House.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. And as you say, it's 4 days to the US election, and we face a choice between an elderly, hugely unpredictable madman who is going to be in charge of a very powerful arsenal with thousands of nuclear weapons capable of blowing up the world several times over, and a sane person, actually somebody I rather admire, who is going to be hemmed in, if she wins, by all kinds of domestic pressures, the pro-Israel lobby, the fossil fuel interests, and the military-industrial complex. And so the reason I'm favouring this motion, the reason I welcome the decline of American power, is that I think no government should be in a position of this kind to decide the future of the world. It's just impossible. And when I say that, and when I say I welcome the decline of the United States, I don't mean that I welcome the rise of Russia and China. On the contrary, Russia and China are very dangerous autocracies who are huge threats both to their own people and to their neighbours. But my concern is this continued geopolitical military competition actually legitimizes Russia and China rather than thinks about how one could change those types of regimes. I know Professor Mearsheimer, who's going to speak in a minute, argues that the expansion of NATO was a cause of the war in Ukraine. I don't actually agree with him. I think the cause of the war in Ukraine has to do with the oligarchic, repressive nature of President Putin and his obsession with Russian ethno-nationalism. But it did provide a pretext. And that is my big concern, that actually this almost imaginary geopolitical military competition is mutually legitimizing. What I favor is a multilateralist system rather than a geopolitical system. And what I hope is that the rise of middle-level powers like South Africa or South Korea, or regional organizations like the European Union or the African Union, and the increasing relevance of global public opinion is what can make that possible. So let me turn to the actual nature of American power. I'm not actually sure whether the United States is declining or not, because it's a matter of perception. And American power very much depends on our memory of the American role in World War II. And that's, in a way, what's being reproduced over and over again in our imagination in the geopolitical competition. But when American military power has actually been used, the results have been very different. It's incredibly difficult nowadays to win or to do what the famous strategist Thomas Schelling called compellence. You can be incredibly destructive, but it's very hard to achieve political goals in the way that Clausewitz wanted great powers to do. So America has fought these wars in the last few decades. It's fought the wars in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. They did untold damage. Hundreds of thousands of people died. And they left those countries in a situation no better, perhaps worse, than they were before. And it's not just the wars. I mean, the war on terror, we've had the war on terror for 2 decades, and terrorism is far worse than it was in 2001. ISIS controls large parts of Africa. There are terrorist groups all over the Middle East and Europe. What?
Point of information.
What?
The war on terror to prevent any future attacks on the U.S. homeland. And since 2001, that has been effectively the case. In the past 2 decades, that's been the case in most of Europe, too, that it's drastically diminished any significant terrorism on America.
But the problem, if in terms of the proposition is, it may be fine if you're American, but what about the rest of us? That's why I welcome the... And I think, it's not just that it hasn't worked. I just think it's normalized all kinds of things that shouldn't have been normalized. It's normalized targeted assassination. That was never something acceptable in the laws of war. What it does is it makes people like Hania or Nasrallah into martyrs when they should be treated as criminals and dealt with in courts. It's normalized the idea that you go after combatants where what you call combatants, is there a difference? Are terrorists combatants or criminals? But let's say they're combatants. You go after them wherever they are.
Wasn't Anwar Sadat and also Gandhi also targeted for assassination?
Wasn't who?
Gandhi and Anwar Sadat were also assassinated along with
Of course they were, but it was unacceptable. It was unacceptable to assassinate them. And most people thought this was unacceptable, and now it's become acceptable. It's okay to go and assassinate people now if you think they're a bad person. But who can decide whether they're a bad person? You need to judge them in a court. And, the idea that you can kill combatants at home, outside a combat zone, because it's easier to find them when they're at home, or you can kill them in hospitals, and you can destroy the hospitals because there are terrorists there, which has increasingly become acceptable. These are really worrying developments as a consequence of the war on terror. And what is more, the language of the war on terror has been taken up by Russia and China. So Putin uses the language of the war on terror. He used it to justify what he was doing in Chechnya. He used it in Syria. China uses it in their war against the Uyghurs. So what?
I just feel like making a bit too much out of the language used regarding the war on terror, but this kind of rhetoric can be seen all throughout the history of nations. I mean, Justinian going to war against the Persians in order to protect the Christian population. You can make these sorts of arguments without an American war on terror, so I don't see how this is unique.
Well, I think that the war on terror represents a break with the American tradition. I mean, the Americans claim that they uphold international law. And that what they're doing, actually, is to redefine international law. And surely we're better than that. Surely we should be able to rise above these issues and try to make the world a little bit more rights-based and law-based than it was in the past. So, as well as military power, I think we should also be thinking about economic power. But before I say that, I just want to say one thing. When I say all this, it's not that I'm against military power. On the contrary, I think we need military power to deal with violations of international law. We need military power to deal with the crime of aggression. We need military power to deal with the crime of genocide. We need military power to deal with crimes against humanity. But if we're serious about international law, that military power has to be defensive and has to be aimed at protecting people and civilians. And that's where I think we need to go through a big change, because the old paradigm where military power was all about defeating enemies simply doesn't work. Okay, I've got 1 minute, just 2 things to say. One is economic power. The US, the dollar is the global international currency. The Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort. What that means is that America, unlike the rest of us, can borrow as much as it likes. And the effect of that is to suck resources from the rest of the world to the United States. Now, that doesn't mean I favour a BRICS currency, but I think what we need to go back to is a kind of democratic IMF, where the special drawing rights become a serious international currency. And that's the direction that we need to move in terms of economic power. Let me come to the end, and let me say that here we are in a really terrifying moment, with horror in Gaza and Lebanon, with the war continuing in Ukraine. Let me say that I would love it if whoever becomes president will continue to support Ukraine and indeed increase military assistance to Ukraine. Let me say that I would really hope that whoever becomes president uses their leverage to stop the war in the Middle East. But I think what's terrifying is that here we are. Yes, I'm going to finish. Here we are, 2 days away, and everything, the whole future of the planet, not just war, but climate change, all of these things, probably depends on 10,000 votes in Wisconsin. So, you know, what we need is, and it's up to us who are not Americans, or maybe who are Americans too, to try to think, to be responsible, and to try to press for a different kind of rights-based, law-based world. I mean, I think the ICJ decision that the South Africans brought, the ICJ case on genocide, the ICC decisions are hugely important. And what they've done is to expose the double standards on international law of the US and the UK. So it's up to the rest of us to push for a multilateralist, human rights-based world. Thank you.